Hi, my name is Jamie Bunting, and today I'm going to talk to you about the theorist John Watson and his major contributions to behaviorism. We will focus on the theory of behaviorism and Watson's contributions. And behaviorism is a theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning. You have operant conditioning, which is the learning of behavior through consequences, and then you have classical conditioning, which is learning to associate two unrelated stimuli with each other, which is primarily what Watson focused on, was classical conditioning. Another major contribution that Watson had was developing psychology into a credible field of study, which was not initially considered because they focused primarily on consciousness and the science of the mind, which was difficult to study with experiments because it was hard to produce valuable and valid and reliable results. And then his two most famous experiments are the Little Albert experiment and the Kerplunk experiment, which was performed with rats. So we'll get into those a little bit later. But Watson believed behavior can be studied in a methodical and recognizable manner with no considerations to the internal mental states of individuals. So he really rejected consciousness. And he felt that analysis of behaviors and reactions was the only objective method to get insight into the human actions. He thought that the consciousness of as a private event was completely unscientific to study, which is what I mentioned. So if psychology was to be a natural science in a creditable field of study, it must be observable and measurable, which he was able to do with behavior of individuals. So let's give Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment that he performed with dogs. You have the unconditioned response that the dog salivates in response to seeing food. Conditioning takes place every time the dog sees the food, a bell is rung. The conditioned response of the dog is now that he will salivate in response to the bell being rung without the food even being present. Behavioralists take this a step further and believe that you can eliminate or reduce phobias in individuals. So given the conditioned stimulus of the rabbit, the boy has a negative or not pleasurable response in his fear of the rabbit. It has a fear of the rabbits. So they introduced an unconditioned stimulus of a plate of cookies, which produces an unconditioned response of pleasure. So when you pair the two, the unconditioned stimulus of the plate of cookies with the conditioned stimulus, the rabbit, it produces an unconditioned response of pleasure. Then, in turn, once this is repeated over and over again and introduce the cookie with the rabbit, it creates no longer a fear of the rabbit and creates a pleasurable response when he sees that rabbit. This is an example of classical conditioning and a behavior therapy method and technique using classical conditioning, which is what most behavioralists will agree with, including Watson. So, as I mentioned, Watson also a major mission of his was to develop a psychology as a creditable field of study. And under the guidance of several influential people, including John Dewey, he was a philosopher, and the work of Ivan Pavlov, they were an integral part in his success in developing science into a creditable field. And he's the founder of behaviorism, which defines psychology as a scientific study of observable behavior. That was the ultimate contributions. And he truly pushed for psychology to no longer be considered the science of the mind and studying the consciousness of individuals. Let's get into the experiments, the Kerplunk experiment and Little Albert experiment. And Watson did most of his research on animal behavior, child rearing, and advertising. So let's focus on Little Albert experiment first. And this study was conducted in 1920. And I'll start off that it is unethical, and today it would not be an experiment that would be replicated due to the unethical accord of the American Psychological Association's code, and then legislation has further been passed to prevent such potentially harmful experiments due to the expected risks of the subject. So the aim of Watson and Rayner was to condition a phobia in an emotionally stable child. So you have little Albert, he's a 9-month-old infant. And before the experiment takes place, Albert is given he's introduced to a couple different animals. First, a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and then several different masks. And during these time, he had no initial response. He observed and watched the animals, and that was about it. No significant reaction took place. So during the experiment, Albert was allowed to play with the animals. So at this point, Watson and Rayner, as Albert would touch the animals and play with them, they would strike a steel bar with a hammer and make an extremely loud noise every time the baby touched the rat. Albert responded to the noise by crying and showing extreme fear. After several pairings of the two stimuli, which is that classical conditioning, Albert was presented with only the rat. And upon seeing the rat, Albert got very distressed. He would cry and try and crawl away. Apparently, the infant associated the white rat with the noise. So, and originally, that neutral stimulus, the rat, had become a conditioned stimulus and elicited an emotional response to that conditioned response of distress. And then the unconditioned response, given the noise, was the stimulus. So now you have this whole reaction. And little Albert seemed to generalize his response to the white rat with other furry animals. And such as the bunny, the dog, a monkey, and then even a Santa Claus mask that had furry white cotton balls on it. So he generalized this response to other furry objects, which is interesting because his overall goal of this experiment and his overall accomplishment was that he not only determined this, you can see behaviors in animals, but you can also see they're observable in human beings as well. That was the major accomplishment of the study. He mimicked Ivan Pavlov's experiment on dogs and replicated it to human beings, which is the first time this had been performed on humans. So let's move into the Kerplunk experiment. The Kerplunk experiment is a famous stimulus response experiment conducted on the rats, and it demonstrates the ability to turn voluntary motor responses into a conditioned response. So it actually got its name after the sound the rat would make after running into the wall of the maze. They go kerplunk. So they were trained to run a straight alley-like maze for a food reward, which the food reward was located at the end of the alleyway. Watson found that once the rat was well trained, it performed almost automatically on reflex. They dropped the rat in, and it would go straight to the reward. Upon learning the maze over time, repeated over and over, they started to run faster through each length and turn. This routine was continued until the length of the path changed, however. So this is where the study takes place, okay? So they started to change the path after that trained rat had really mastered the maze. So if the conditioned rats were released into the alleyway and the path was shortened, they would run straight into the end of the wall, making a kerplunk sound. The first trial found they would run full speed, passing up the food passing the food that had been moved even closer. So since the path had been shortened, the food had been moved closer, but they completely bypassed it and continued running the maze and would make that kerplunk sound as they hit the wall. If the path was longer, the rats would run as usual until they reached their customary distance, the distance at which the food would normally be, okay? And then what they would do is they would pause to sniff the area, even though they had not reached the end of the alley. And they would often ignore the reward, the food, if the path was farther away, which is just, I think that's very interesting. So Watson truly believed that you could learn human psychology through observable behavior in animals, and that he felt we were very similar in these ways. You could study that observable behavior in animals and then mimic it to adults, which he found several times. So again, I hope you enjoy watching this. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know after reviewing this video. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.